So let's go now just quickly to verse 12. I don't want to take up too much time on this, but it says, Then the disciples came to him and said, Do you know that the Pharisees, when they heard this word, when they heard this statement, were offended? Look at the reaction within the internal narrative, the internal plot and narrative. Jesus is saying stuff that's offensive. Like, we should have already known that, based on that it would be offensive. But you get to see the witness of someone within the narrative saying that, look, this is causing chaos and confusion. It's causing division. It's causing hurt feelings. Look at Jesus. Look at what you're doing. So look, that is what the power of a prophet, of a teacher, of the Son of God, of people who are led by Christ. What will happen is that we will also end up having chaos and division. So now what we're going to do is turn our attention to the epistle of James. And let me just, we're going to start here in James chapter 2, verse 14. Now, hold on, I have to figure out what I'm doing real quick, because I have some notes that I wanted to look at what I'm going to do with James 15. Oh, well, I can't find my notes on James 2, so we're just gonna keep going. So here's what we're doing. Verse 14. Now notice that James is, from beginning to end, a social justice text. It's our best example of wisdom literature in the New Testament, other than we've got some of Jesus' sayings and teachings. But the Epistle of James really talks about how it really reflects back and applies Jesus' teachings in his life and ministry. Paul, like I said, I think, didn't do a lot of that. He focused on the death and resurrection of Jesus, and very rarely, at least in the writings. Now, probably when Paul taught in person, he probably reflected more. We've got traditions in 1 Corinthians 11 where Paul knows some of Jesus' teachings from life. But anyway, let's not get into that. We've got a lot of the teachings of the Epistle of James resonate with the teachings of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. So let's look at James 2, verse 14. What is the benefit, or what is the advantage, or what is the point? What is the point, my siblings, and I'm going to make that gender neutral. What is the point, my siblings, if someone says they have faith but do not have works, right? What is the point, my brethren or my siblings, if someone says they have faith but they don't have works? Is faith able to save them? And I'm making this gender neutral. Literally, is faith able to save him? Now, in Greek, you have different ways of asking a question. You can tag a question with an adverb here that tells the reader what the expected answer of the question is. So if you have no negative particle here, it would just be a straight question of like, is faith able to save him, without expecting an answer one way or another. If you have the word may here, your expected answer is no. If you have the word ooh, your expected answer is yes. So may with the question is faith able to save him? No, of course not. If you had ooh here, is faith able to save him? Yes, that would be. So you can tell what the implied or expected answer of the question is just based on the Greek. And it's hard to do this in English, so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this in Greek. But here we go. So faith is not able to save him, or to restore him, or to keep him whole, or to deliver him. Now, if, verse 15, if a brother or sister. Now, if some of you are used to reading modern translations, a lot of modern translations will make it gender neutral. whenever they say the word adelphos, which means brother or sibling. So they'll take it wherever it says adelphoi, they'll translate it as brothers and sisters, or wherever they see adelphos, they'll just say brother or sister. But I just want to point out that in the Greek here, you actually have the word for sister right here. If a brother or sister is naked, and this word naked here is not a sexual nakedness. It is a lack of clothing, especially a lack of clothing when it's cold. If you don't have enough clothing to stay warm, that's what this word means. So if a brother or sister is lacking, if a brother or sister is lacking clothing or lacking daily food, but one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warm, and be well fed." Now, the be warm refers to not having enough clothing, and the be well fed refers to not having the daily food. So James's point is, if one of you, so if a brother or sister is naked or is lacking in daily food, but one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warm and well fed," but do not give them the necessary things of the body, right? Let's talk about social justice. You can't just say we're all children of God and then ignore the body, the physical body of the people that are all made in the image of God. So it says, if you say that without giving to them the necessary things of the body, what good is that? What is the advantage? What advantage is that? And then verse 17. So also, faith, if it does not have works, is dead by itself. So this could be translated, so then faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Or you could say faith, if it does not have works, is dead because it's by itself. Something like that. Either one is a possible way of expressing in English something that is quite clear in the Greek. And it's always hard to match up the English to the structure and the word order of the Greek, but it's very clear what's happening is if faith without works is dead. Now let's go down here to verse 16. For, and here's the conjunction for just as the body without spirit, or without breath even, pneuma means spirit or breath or wind, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And this is really, really clear, especially in the social justice context. If you say things like, all lives matter, but then don't have any action behind it. If you say we're all children of God, but don't have any action behind it. Or if you say, well, God loves everyone, and then don't have any action behind it, you didn't actually say anything right. Because it's an empty shell. It's hypocrisy. You're checking off a box without even figuring out what the weightier matters of the Torah are. So I should really, let's see. I don't think there's anything else I wanted to say about James chapter 2, other than you have a very strong emphasis on the concept of you can't just say the words. If you just say the words and have the right doctrine, which to some extent the Pharisees did, like they had on paper some of the right check boxes, but then they didn't, at least the way the Pharisees are characterized by the Gospels. Now we've got a little bit of a different characterization of the Pharisees in Josephus, and they're not as bad. They're not the bad guys. They're actually quite respectable. And I think even seeing through the lines within the New Testament, there are respectable Pharisees and respectful ways of approaching the Pharisees. But hold on one second. I need to get a drink. Okay. So now let's talk about this. Let's look at this. Going back and looking at the emphasis, you've got a neighbor in literal need, and then you've got someone just saying words. That's awful. That's totally awful. I think that's where you get the all lives matter stuff. People want to say something that is technically true. Okay, I have to admit that in a very narrow sense, like out of the context and the way it's used as currency, all lives matter is a true statement, okay? That is true. But it's when do you say that? And how do you say that? And who's the power behind it? And is it comforting someone or is it afflicting someone? Is it ignoring the problem? And is it accompanied by action or not? See, that's the whole thing. A really biblical way of looking at it is you can't just get the truths right. You have to get the emphasis right and the contrast right and the tone right. And a lot of people that are saying all lives matter are completely not in alignment with what James is teaching here, or with what Jesus is teaching. So yeah, just it is so awful that people will notice a neighbor in need and then just say words. Right? And we're going to look at Rebecca Taylor's article, and where she's going to say a lot of words, but there's no call to action. And as you'll see, people who are comforted by her article don't want Jesus to be Lord of their life. Now, I want Jesus to be Lord of my life, and that's tough. It's not easy, right? Well, Jesus does say in Matthew 11, my yoke is easy, because God empowers us with the ability and the joy to do those things, right? But on a secular level, it's not easy. And that's really what I'm wondering is when I read Rebecca Taylor's article, I don't get the impression that she wakes up every day thinking about how she can make life better for people. I don't get the impression that she's there to fight for those with the least access to power. I get that I don't know her personally, but I get this impression from her article that she's checking off the box. And she does this a lot in her article. She'll leave crumbs in there of like, oh yes, like there's racism and there's these problems and those are real. But, and here you can tell, yeah, I think the word "but" is highly problematic in this context. And she'll say, but we shouldn't actually do any social justice theory, right? We shouldn't look at that. And so what she's trying to do is she's just tossing out these crumbs saying, yes, there's some racism, yes, there's tragedies, yes, there's oppression, mostly in the past. And she does that not out of seriousness. Well, I can't really judge her intention. I can judge the impact. What the impact is that she ends up doing what James says not to do, is say the words but not do the action. She's throwing out there that yes, there's racism. I think, and it serves to help comfort people checking off a box. Okay, so maybe it's about time to get to her article itself, and we'll see what happens. So let me just figure out how I can switch over to the article. Hopefully it's right here. Okay, so here we have the article, Why Latter-day Saints Should Be Concerned About Social Justice Ideology. Ooh, there's a lot to talk about here, and like I said, I don't want to go point by point through all of this because it will take a long time. And I hope my colleagues James, Elise, and Channing are going to do some of that. But let's talk about this. And I've already covered some of this, but how does this function? And a lot of this, you'll notice in the first paragraph here, it says, oh, look, compassion and a desire for justice and fairness. Like, that's good. But you'll see that she's checking off a box because she doesn't actually call for any action anywhere, as far as I know. And she says, yes, there's real racial problems. Okay, another checkbox. And she's checking all these boxes. Police brutality, racial profiling. She's signaling that she's a good person. Okay, and she's signaling that she's trying to be partially woke. And I don't think it succeeds because the proof is in the pudding. You know, that's what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. You will know them by their fruits. Matthew chapter 7. Anyway. So the word, let's look at this. Critical social justice ideology. I've never heard anyone call it that. She's just using this as a term of contempt. And now she talks about it as a worldview. And I think this is one of the biggest flaws in her whole piece is she thinks of this academic approach, the critical social justice approach, as a worldview. It's not a worldview. It is an analytical tool. It's an analytical tool you can use as part of any worldview or none or whatever. It's not a worldview. It is a tool that has limitations, and it has all sorts of other stuff, and it functions in certain contexts. It's not a complete. My worldview is that of Christ, right? The Christian, the worldview of Christ and His church. But anyway, now it's not the one true way. Like I said, it's a tool. It's a tool that you can apply in some cases and other cases, like if you're doing mathematics, if you're doing anything like that. Like there's just times and places that it applies, and at times it doesn't. So now let's talk about this. This ideology is in opposition to traditional theory. Now she sweeps a whole like 2,000 years of intellectual heritage and debate and dialectic into something called traditional theory. I don't know what she's doing there. Is she putting Adam Smith and Karl Marx in the same box? Because she's basically saying anything that comes before critical social justice theory is the traditional theory. There's no one traditional theory. There's all sorts of things. And let's talk about what this worldview. It's not a worldview. Critical social justice is an analytical tool, and here's the thing: it's not the one true way. But what I will say is that it's essential for certain questions, because there are certain features of our world you can't understand without it. Let me say that again. There are certain features of our world you can't understand without understanding social justice theory, which is a different claim, a very different claim than saying it's the one true way or the one true worldview. And talking about traditional theory, we've got a whole bunch of things that came up before. Now she's tying in. I have to admit, I don't even know what postmodernism is. Like, my field is biblical studies. Like, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm not even going to touch that. But she's basically saying everything that comes before postmodernism is this one traditional theory. But you've got a whole bunch of diversity and complexity within the Western, and I'm speaking to the Western philosophical tradition. You've got empiricism, you've got rationalism, you've got appeals to intuition versus appeals to evidence. All of that is traditional theory. Now she's saying that traditional theory uses reason and logic to interpret the world. And I think that's really unfair, because what she's calling critical social justice ideology also uses reason and logic to interpret the world. Okay? And here she says, certainly the movement fueled by this ideology has led to some positive developments. So here she's checking a box. She's just checking a box and not actually calling for further action. Now, I'm not even going to address any of this paragraph right here, in part because I don't know these scholars and writers. But here's the central thesis. She says, I believe that critical social justice ideology, which often operates more like a religious theology, which that's not true. Now, even if people twist it that way, that's not even what it's intended to do. And now she's saying it's contrary to Latter-day Saint beliefs, which she probably doesn't really know Latter-day Saint beliefs the way I do, and therefore should be of particular concern to Latter-day Saints. Okay, let's talk about this. We should even give some examples of because she's talking around it. She doesn't even give an example of one of the deliverables of critical race theory or our contemporary approach to social justice. And let's talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, because this is a critical piece, and by critical, we don't mean like mean or negative. We mean you need to use critical thinking, like analytical thinking, that takes a deep look with reason and logic. Right here, reason and logic, that's what the word critical means, okay? Reason and logic. You're using some of your reasoning skills to analyze something. And let's look at Kimberly Crenshaw's approach to intersectionality from the 1980s. And I'm going to oversimplify it just for this, and boil it down to one hypothetical case. And this comes partly out of the legal and from the legal and judicial system, right? So this isn't some theoretical thing. This isn't some postmodern thing. It actually has real world impact. And let's talk about this. For example, you've got a case of discrimination, employment discrimination, where a black woman is denied employment from a place. And then there's a lawsuit. And then the employer says, no, we're not discriminatory because we don't discriminate against black people and we don't discriminate against women. Therefore, we're off the hook. And they point to all these black people that they hired, and they point to all these women that they hired, and they say, look, we're completely off the hook. When you analyze it, we're not discriminatory. But here's where the analytical tool comes in. Kimberly Crenshaw comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, let's actually look at it. Let's use some reason and logic here and take a closer look at what's going on here. You, as the employer, you hire a lot of women, but they're all white women. And they're all women working in the office. And then Crenshaw says, look, you hire black men, but they're all working on the factory floor, right? So you have a place for white women and you have a place for black men. But when a black woman applies and wants to work there, you have rejected her because you don't want her for example, you don't want her in the office because you only want white people in the office. Something like that, okay? If you only look at the race angle or at the gender angle, you will miss the big problem, right? Imagine two roads that cross each other, a literal intersection, and you can be hit by something coming down from both sides from either road. So this is, now there's no worldview behind it. There's no worldview behind, or at least from what I understand, this piece of social justice theory, right? To say that we need to look at various pieces of the puzzle and how they connect with each other and how they conspire with one another rather than look at them individually. That's actually using reason and logic to interpret the world. It's not an ideology behind it. It's not like Crenshaw says you have to buy into postmodernism to see what's going on. She says, no, you just have to not take these variables separately, but you have to look at them together. That's one of the deliverables of what Rebecca Taylor is calling critical social justice ideology. Anyway, so let's go on to some of these other things. Yeah, and here's wait, no, let's go back to this religious theology thing, because so much of critical, I'm not going to use the word critical social justice ideology anymore, because A, it's long, and B, she's prejudicing the whole thing, and I'm not going to play her game. I'm going to call it awareness of justice from here on out, okay? What she, a theoretical and analytical awareness of justice, okay? So now she's saying an awareness of justice operates like a religious theology, but her problem is that this awareness of justice actually has the spirit of humility. If you look at the progressive woke world, we're all about checking ourselves. We're all about double checking and making sure that we have all the pieces, and having the humility to know that we have all the pieces, and the humility to know that no one is 100% woke on everything. If she actually had a living engagement with the social justice world, she would realize it's so much more humble and tentative and open to revision than anything that's analogous to a religion. So I just needed to say that. So let's look at this. Let's talk about immutable characteristics such as whiteness. Okay, so an awareness of justice views whiteness as shameful. First of all, that's not true. Second of all, I need to say, well, we in the awareness of justice world don't always, and this is true in the academic world, people in the academic world in any field, liberal, conservative, progressive, woke, fascist, whatever, every academic is going to use buzzwords slightly differently than the way normal people use them. That's just how it is, okay? I'm sorry. So this isn't a criticism of academia. It also isn't a criticism of the social justice world. But there's a problem in communication when people don't realize how we're using the word whiteness. There's a lot to unpack with the word whiteness. To me, whiteness isn't a biological thing. It is a social and cultural construct that relates to power and not biology. Okay? Like, if you plop me into the middle of Africa 2,000 years ago, I won't have any whiteness. Like, because it's not within the context where white people have economic, educational advantage and supremacy over others. Like, whiteness only makes sense as a power construct. It is not the biological fact, which, let's go to the word immutable here, right? It is not no one is born with whiteness. Okay, and let's back up and talk about whiteness as a cultural construct. I am not literally white. Like, if you put my hand next to a literal white piece of paper, it's not white. It's basically a lie. It's a cultural convention that somehow my skin is labeled as white. And that ties into a lot of other things around white as pure and clean and stuff. But I am not literally white biologically. Like, if you look at the color of my skin, I know it's pretty pale, but it's not white. And the same thing with blackness, right? And so when we talk about whiteness, we're not talking about the fact that you are a European descent person. That's not what whiteness is. Whiteness is a power relationship and a power dynamic. Okay, and so if we talk about we want to eliminate whiteness, we don't want to, it's not genocide. We want to just make people have the opportunity to be equal, okay? And I don't think having white skin is shameful. Like, we are not saying that. And I think quoting Robin DiAngelo doesn't actually, because racism is structural and systemic. It's not completely the fault of any one person, and it's something that's inherited and also personal. I mean, we don't want to say racism. We don't want to focus. Let's get back to emphasis. We don't want to focus on the structural and systemic aspects to the exclusion of noticing the personal individual components of racism when it comes out, right? Okay. But, so yeah. Now let's talk about this original sin thing. And here's something we'll notice is that Rebecca Taylor uses all these buzzwords and a lot of proof texts that are very popular in the LDS world because she's signaling a special kind of like, oh, I'm with it, I'm a faithful Latter-day Saint, and she's trying to comfort the people who identify as Latter-day Saints and aren't on board with social justice. And let's talk about this original sin, because here she's getting into one of my areas of expertise, which is this original sin piece. And let's talk about this in terms of the Jubilee in Leviticus 25, right? People will be punished for their own sins and not for Adam's transgression. First of all, equality is not a punishment. If we try to make a more just society, that's not punishment. That's just something where everyone is better off being in right relationship with everyone else. So what this is talking about is, what the second article of faith is addressing is the sort of Calvinist approach to original sin, is that so Adam did something, and now we will be arbitrarily punished for something someone else did. Okay? Now that's different than saying, okay, my ancestors unfairly had an advantage, and I, to this day, benefit from that advantage, and I have inherited a world that is set up for my benefit as a white man. Now, I'm not being punished for what my ancestors did. If to say, no, we need to have other people have the same head start as I do. That's not punishing me, okay? It's not an artificial or arbitrary punishment to say, hey, let's not kill black people, right? I don't understand how saying let's not kill black people is a punishment to me. I don't get this at all. And then same thing with Ezekiel 18:20. Oh, and I didn't even get to my point about the Jubilee. So in the Jubilee year, every 50 years, you had a reboot of the economic and agricultural systems in the land of Israel, where debts would be forgiven and land that was sold to escape poverty. You needed, if you had to sell your land in order to survive, you would get your land back. And it might not even be you, because the Jubilee year happens every 50 years. And so it was your ancestors that sold the land, or your ancestors that bought the land, and all of a sudden, magically, it goes back to the original family. That's not a punishment. The Jubilee does not punish you for what your ancestors did. It just restores the way it should have been, and resets the economic advantage so that no one accumulates a generational advantage or a generational disadvantage. And that's exactly what we're talking about with a lot of social justice issues, and why you can't just analyze people as individuals, as a black individual and a white individual, and say, well, they're all equal now and they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Because if you don't understand the intergenerational perpetuation of privilege, you're going to miss a whole bunch of stuff. And let's talk about Joseph in Egypt. So Joseph was sold into Egypt by his brothers, okay? That was the, quote, original sin for this, for my point here, right? So now the descendants of Joseph were still slaves in Egypt, okay? And this was, centuries later. You had the liberation of the slaves. When you liberated the slaves from Egypt, you're not punishing the Egyptians for what their ancestors did. First of all, it wasn't even their ancestors that enslaved Joseph to begin with. It was his brothers that sold him into slavery, and then the Egyptians got him. But anyway, that all happened later on. That all happened so much earlier than the Exodus. So the Exodus narrative isn't about punishing anyone for what happened in the generation of Joseph. What happens is the Israelite slaves were liberated because that's the right thing to do, right? And you can say, well, oh no, the Egyptians lost their property, and that's a punishment, and they're being punished for something that they didn't do, which was done centuries earlier. No. Social justice isn't a punishment. Now, I will say that people who have an unfair advantage will no longer have that unfair advantage if you make the world actually fair, and you can but I think it's inappropriate to call that a punishment. It's kind of like saying, okay, if my friend steals a bunch of money and gives me some, and I had no part of that, and I have this stolen money, and then the person who legitimately owns it gets it back, am I being punished for someone else's sin? No, I am not being punished for the sin of my friend who stole the money and gave it to me, because taking the money back isn't a punishment, because the only way it could be seen as a punishment is if I had a rightful claim to that money, and then it was my money and it was taken away. That would be a punishment. But if my friend steals money and gives it to me, he does not have the legal right to give me that money. So that transaction is flawed. That's not my money. That's not his money. It's not my money. So when it's taken back, it's not a punishment. So even if I inherit an advantage and that advantage is later taken away, that is not a punishment, because that is an advantage that I unfairly had to begin with. Even though I didn't do anything wrong to get it, I just inherited it. Taking away an unfair advantage is not a punishment. Okay, now I better keep going because we're not going to get through this article. let's talk about this group identity versus other identity. So here Rebecca Taylor is complaining that we're talking about groups. And part of what we said, like with Kimberly Crenshaw, is there's certain things that you can't understand about the world without using logic and reason and observation to figure out what's going on with some groups, right? Okay, so let's talk about group identity. And what I find really, really concerning here is singing the song, I Am a Child of God. Because she's appealing to the heartstrings of people. Like, say, look, we're all children of God, and we sing that in our songs, and so I've checked the box, and I'm good. I'm right with God, I'm right with everyone else. And she's not right with either, okay? Because let's talk about this. She says, Latter-day Saint theology asserts that one's identity as a beloved child of heavenly parents is far more important than any other identity. And actually, separating this from the current conversation, yeah, that's true. Or at least my view is that our identity as offspring of God is the foundation of all of our other identities. Now, we don't erase those other identities. And just like on a human level, if you have a gay kid, you love the gay kid. You don't say, oh, he's just my kid, and I just forget the gay part. Some of your kids are going to be gay. Some of your kids are going to be straight. Some are going to be trans. And you love them for who they are because they're your kid. So emphasizing our identity as children of God doesn't erase those other pieces of identity, but they presuppose it because God loves us for who we are as children of God, okay? Now, here's a real interesting thing. I have no idea where Rebecca Taylor feels about the role of women in the church. And I need to name that I'm completely pro-women. So I think that women should have all of the equality and responsibilities and access as men do in the church. Because we're all are children of God. Now, so let's talk about this, okay? And there may be, I want to ask Rebecca Taylor what her view of women's ordination is within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because if your most important identity is being a child of parents and not of any group, right? That we shouldn't, where does she say group identity? Oh, look, one's place in God's kingdom transcends group identity. Right? If she really believes that, she had better support the ordination of women and the leadership of women and the decision-making roles of women, because women are part of a group of women, right? To be a woman is to basically, let me put it this way. To discriminate against women is to make their membership in the group of women the most important part of their identity for the purpose of that discrimination. Like, no matter how faithful or powerful or spirit-filled a woman is, like, none of those identities matter because you're making her gender the most important part of her identity for those purposes if you discriminate against women. And look, she even quotes where it says male and female right here in 2 Nephi 26:33, which I love, which is a great social justice text. Which she's taking out of context to say, look, we don't need to do any action, right? She is soothing the conscience of her reader and saying, look, we don't have to do any action. We're all set, and this is where we get the whole faith without works is dead thing again. Because, yeah, and let's look at Galatians 3:28. In the context of Galatians, Paul is trying to end a persecution and end a double standard by saying Jew and Gentile are alike unto. Well, he doesn't say they're alike unto God, but what he says is that Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female are all one in Christ. And so I think it's really misleading where she says the worth of souls, not groups, is great in the sight of God. Because first of all, not groups is not even the emphasis or the focus of D&C 18. Now I'm glad that she puts it in brackets here to show that she's adding it. But making the contrast between souls and groups is not at all within the context of D&C 18. And in fact, when you think about groups are nothing just than a group of souls, right? When you have a group of people, if you care about the souls of the individuals, then you have to care about the soul of the groups, because the group is nothing more than the set of those individuals. Okay, and let's talk about her quotation of the no more ites here. Neither were there Lamanites nor any manner of ites. But what she doesn't do is talk about how do you get there, right? How did they get to that place where there were no more ites, right? Because she's saying, well, that's where we are now, right? That there's no more ites. But when you look at the narrative arc of the Book of Mormon, how did they get there? They got there by abandoning their hostility towards one another. They got there by stopping killing one another. There's prerequisites that they had to do to get to the place where there's no ites. They didn't just say there's no ites and still kill each other, right? They had to stop the hostility and the oppression and the killing in order to even be able to say that there were no more ites. So saying that there's no more ites without actually doing anything about it is faith without works. It's checking a box. It's worshiping God with your lips, but having your heart far from him. Okay? And let's look at the context of 2 Nephi 26:33. The context is a missionary invitation. You know, it's saying that no one will be denied, that everyone is invited to a repentance, and that's true. It's not a commentary on the facts on the ground of who is, how do I say this? Like, whether or not there's any systemic advantage or disadvantage. It's not saying that. Of course, there are those problems on the ground, but it's addressing a different question, and it's not ignoring them or pretending they don't exist, but in a sense it's even presupposing them. Okay, so now let's go. Yes, this thing about it asserts that one's primary focus in life should be to strive for equity. I don't actually see that. Okay, I think that first of all, it's still treating it as a worldview. It is not a worldview. Awareness of justice is not a worldview. It's an analytical tool, right, to help you see things that you wouldn't have seen without that tool. But it's not the whole point of life. It's not the whole point of anything. But I will agree. And she's doing these little tags here of quoting the scriptures as currency to show that how righteous she is and how with it she is and how Christ-focused she is. But she actually doesn't focus on all of what Christ did, almost everything he did during his mortal life, his teaching, his healing, his feeding people. Like, so much of what he did, so much of what he lived for and died for is around social justice and power structures. Now let's talk about agency here. Okay? And I think she's really missing the point, because she's having a conversation about agency when she should be having a conversation about accountability. And agency doesn't work without accountability. Let's look back at the original War in Heaven, where Lucifer wanted to take away our free will, that we didn't even have the option of choosing. And therefore, if we don't have the option of choosing, there's no accountability. Right? We're not accountable for those choices if there's no choice. Now, here's what she's confusing. She's confusing free will with the lack of consequences for your free choices. So yes, we do have free will. We are able to make choices. We should not be internally, artificially robots that we not allowed to have choices. Now, here's the thing, though, that she doesn't say is whether we should have consequences for our freely chosen choices. Yes, our choices are free, but they're not free from consequences. And that's very clear in the Book of Mormon. It's very clear in the Bible. It's very clear everywhere that there will be consequences, natural consequences to your choices. Like if I stick my hand in a fire and I get burned, I'm not going to say, "Oh no, that fire done didn't respect my agency." No, I had agency and I stuck my hand in the fire and it hurt. Right? There's natural and automatic consequences that flow from our choices. And I just don't get how she's making this a conversation about agency. What she's trying to do is she's mislabeling this entire this entire discussion right here around agency when it should be labeled around accountability and consequences, because what she's trying to do is saying that yes, we should be racist, sexist, and not have any consequences for it. That's really what she's saying. That's not an agency conversation. That's an accountability question. Okay? And so she's saying, well, in our cancel culture, you might... Okay, well, let's look at this. Kind of going like the hand in the fire thing. Okay? Suppose that I have a black employer. And, well, no, I better not use myself. Suppose this guy has a black employer and decides, I'm going to go up and call my black employer a racial slur. And then he gets fired from his job, which I think is a fairly natural consequence. If you are not respectful and if you are not a safe place, making the workplace a safe place, if you're working with customers, like, you are a liability if you're that type of person. If you're going to work with customers, coworkers, or anyone, if you have those ideas, it's not safe for you to be there. And you are now a liability. And it is very well within the employer's rights to fire you if you are racist. Like, I don't see that as anti-agency, because he's not saying, I'm going to force you, like, by rewiring your brain to do the right thing. He's saying, no, yeah, you have the free choice to say what you want at work, but you aren't free from the consequences of your free choice. Okay? So yeah, I definitely think that if you are hurtful, misogynistic, sexist, racist, ableist, whatever, and it rises to that level, then yes, you should be deplatformed or fired or whatever. I don't know. And this gets back to something up here. Going back to the faith without works is dead, or just saying the words, I am a child of God. She gives me the perspective that she's the type of person, and I know we're not supposed to always compare everyone to the Nazis, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm not comparing her to the Nazis exactly, but here's what I'm doing. Imagine if someone goes up to the gates of a concentration camp and sees the Jews and the LGBT individuals and the Poles and everyone else, and people who are disabled and people who are political prisoners, seeing them all loaded into the death camp. And she stands at the gate of the concentration camp and starts singing, I am a child of God. Right? And not doing anything about it. If you can stand at the gate of a concentration camp and sing, I am a child of God, what does that say? What does that say? I mean, it says that you can say the words, you can walk the walk, but you can talk the talk, but not walk the walk. That faith without works is dead. And this is exactly what Jesus is talking about with the lips. This people honors me with their lips, right? And she's focusing on what songs she's singing. She's not focusing on what she's doing to help anyone. She's saying, look, we're singing, and worth of souls is great, and all are like unto God. She's saying that. Would she be able? I just don't think there's any humane person that would be able to stand in front of the concentration camp gate, or stand at the auction block and sing, I am a child of God, and not do something about it, and not interrupt the injustice. All of the social justice stuff is about interrupting the injustice that we see. So, and we talked a little bit before in terms of this cancel culture environment. We talked a little bit about the trauma-informed nature and how you have to have a trauma-informed analysis. But anyway, yeah. So this conversation about agency is completely missing the point. Agency doesn't work without accountability, and the question here isn't whether our choices are free, but whether there should be consequences for our free choices. Let me say that again. The conversation here isn't about whether our choices are free, but whether we should have consequences for our free choices. And let's look at this. Ye are free, ye are permitted to act for yourselves. Helaman 14:30. Now here she's tagging these things. Like I said, she probably is deriving her knowledge from the scriptures from a larger cultural piece of these are very frequently quoted things, and it doesn't seem to spring from her original engagement with the scriptures. Because let's look at Helaman 14. I'm going to read all of verses 29 and 30 to you. And this to the intent that whosoever will believe might be saved, and that whosoever will not believe, a righteous judgment might come upon them. And also, if they are condemned, they bring upon themselves their own condemnation. And now remember, my brethren, that whosoever perisheth, perisheth unto himself, and whosoever doeth iniquity, doeth it unto himself. For behold, ye are free, ye are permitted to act for yourselves. For behold, God hath given you unto a knowledge, and he hath made you free. This isn't free from consequences. Like literally in these two verses, you've got about 5 different consequences. A righteous judgment might come upon them, it says. If they are condemned, they bring upon themselves their own condemnations. Whoever perisheth, perisheth unto himself. Doeth iniquity, doeth it unto himself. So after all of those things, then it culminates with the statement, you are free, ye are permitted to act for yourselves. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It doesn't mean that there's no consequences. It means, yes, you are free to choose your action, but you are not free to exempt yourself from the consequences of those actions. It literally says, whoever doeth iniquity, doeth it unto himself. This is exactly what I said earlier about sticking my hand in the fire. Yes, I'm free to stick my hand in the fire, but I'm doing it unto myself if I get hurt. And I'm not going to say, oh no, that fire didn't respect my agency because it's making me not stick my hand in the fire, right? Yeah, no, it's motivating me not to stick my hand in the fire, but it's not denying my agency to do so. And so I think if you go back and look up all of these, I'm probably not going to do that for all of these, but I'm familiar with all of these texts that she's citing, and when you look at them in their own context, it's not saying the same thing that she's making them say, or it's not having the same emphasis or the same tone or the same function. Like just up here, when she's saying, look, we're all alike unto God, she's making it function as a way to anesthetize her conscience and the conscience of her readers, saying, look, we don't need to care about groups. But that's the exact opposite of what this text is saying. It's saying you do need to care about these groups. And same thing with I'm a child of God. She's making that say, look, if I just sing that, then I'm all set. And no, if you really believe that all these children are children of God, you are going to work towards their right treatment and making sure that they have the same head start that everyone else does. Like she's taking all these, and then same thing with this ITES business. She ignores how they got there. And they got there not just by saying that they were all divisionless and all one, but by actually stopping all of the behaviors that prevented them from being one. Okay? And let's talk about this. It rejects the concept of objective truth. Now here we have to go back to my original point that social justice analysis is not a worldview. It is an analytical tool, and it is consistent with every truth. It's just a tool that's used to notice things that you wouldn't otherwise notice. Now, it does bring out this point that most of our academic institutions are, for centuries, have been dominated by white male, especially able-bodied, cisgender, straight white men. Okay, and the problem or the thing that we notice that we wouldn't have noticed right? Like I said, this is an analytical tool that we use to notice things we otherwise wouldn't notice. One thing we notice is that for too long, the opinions of straight white men have been centered to the point where we think they're neutral. We think that whatever straight white men feel or think or have as an opinion, that is the central standard, and that is neutral and objective, and every other thing is somehow marginal or somehow biased or somehow an ideological perspective or somehow a contextual but here's the thing, is that what we've done is realize that being a straight white man isn't a neutral standpoint. Okay? And I think so much of our Western world has privileged the straight white male's thinking that now when you say, hey, look, straight white men aren't neutral and aren't completely impartial, when you say that, it now sounds like you're objecting to the concept of objective truth. No, we're not objecting to objective truth. We are just saying that the straight white male approach shouldn't be identified as objective truth itself, but there's some subjectivity in what straight white men have been saying. Okay? And let's see, where am I going to go with this? And the same thing with this rejecting authority thing. What it does is it rejects the absolute authority of the opinions of the oppressor, right? Which, if you're going to actually take seriously truth, reason, and logic, you can't just say you already know everything. You have to take a step back and check yourself and double check things and say, hey, let's look at all the facts, get all of the voices on the table, and see what's going on. And talking about objective truth, people on my side are all about objective truth because we say that slavery is objectively wrong. It is an objective moral truth that slavery is wrong. Like, my view wouldn't function without objective truth. Same thing with the Holocaust. Like, the Holocaust was wrong. It's not like, oh, they didn't know any better, or that was a long time ago, or we don't say that. We say, no, it was wrong at the time it was done, even if the people didn't think it was wrong. And of course, that's another question. But so this idea that there's no objective truth, that's a slander. That's sort of foisted on my team. And let's talk about this. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right? In the context of John, what he's doing is reassuring people that he is the true and living way, that he is the example, the way. And let's look at his example. Let's look at the truths that he's taught, and let's look at the life that he gives. What he did was he tore down unjust power structures. He was crucified by an unjust power structure. So when he says that he's the true and living way, that's the model or example that we should follow, right? Like, I don't know how you can divorce his words here from his life and character and ministry. And we who are social justice-y people are trying to follow the teachings and of his life and his example and his power as well. So now let's see. This gets back to, and somehow, they're saying that we reject authority, but then earlier she's saying somehow we have the authority to cancel people, right? And I think I think what it is that we're rejecting the automatic assumption of authority for stuff that's not an authority, because men aren't going to be authority on the lived experience of women. And I'm not claiming to be, and just, I think we have to use our critical tools to look at what's going on. And that's not a rejection of authority. Now let's talk about themes of power and dominance. Wow, I can't even begin to talk about themes of power and dominance in the New Testament. Like every page, every page, directly or indirectly, has something to say about power and dominance. Even calling Jesus Lord, kurios, that is a political term. Kurios is also the term for a slave master or slave owner. Like, I'm not saying that that's what Jesus is, although frequently we have people in the New Testament seeing themselves as servants or slaves of Christ. But my point is, all of the language in the New Testament presupposes a conversation around power and dominance. When you say the kingdom language in the Bible, looking at God as a ruler, looking at people, like there's language around power and dominance. There are themes of power and dominance on every page of the New Testament. It's everywhere, And when Jesus died on a Roman cross, and was raised afterward, boy, you've got a conversation about power and dominance. And if you look at his interaction with the Pharisees in Matthew 23 and in Matthew 15, which we looked at, it presupposes the power and dominance that the teaching authority of the Pharisees and scribes had. Like, I think I've said what I'm going to say about that already. And I think there must be a typo here, because this line seems to be a continuation of the quote that started here. I think all of that should be one quote, and then this shouldn't be bold, because I don't think that's a new topic. I think it's just continuing that. But yeah. And I get it that let's look at this. Quoting this out of context. He that is greatest among you shall be your servant. In context, this is about people with privilege giving up their privilege in order to serve those who are marginalized or weaker. And this is exactly what Jesus did. He had all power. He was everything, and he put that on the shelf and came down to earth to be a servant of all. He is the model of servant leadership. Like, I get that she's saying this, but she's missing it within the context. So she's saying Jesus is an example of this, but then we social justice people, when we call people to follow Jesus' example and give up their privilege and serve those who are others, and whatever inherited advantage you had, which Christ had, that you don't use that to hurt other people, but you use it to help other people. Like, she's taking each of these quotations and twisting it to make it say the opposite. I don't even know how this supports what she's saying here, because this presupposes the themes of power and dominance that she says should not be emphasized. It promotes division rather than unity. Well, that's what the disciples said to Jesus. They said, "Oh, look, you are offending the Pharisees." And like, yeah, duh. And now it doesn't. Okay, I think this is unfair here, where it says that awareness of social justice categorizes people into one of two groups. And no, because everyone is on a spectrum of advantage and disadvantage. Everyone is on a spectrum on different variables. On some variables, I will have more privilege. On some variables, I will have less. And everyone, there's no two groups in the world where all of the people on one side are oppressors and all of the other people are oppressed. We've got everyone in all groups having different places on. And look, she talks about intersectional theory. Okay. Which now really it really shows the contradiction. She's saying, well, look, there's only two groups, and now she's saying, well, all of these groups are complex, okay? And I think this is taken out of context, because almost there's no way in our society that an interaction between a white person and a black person in this context will always be in the context of a power structure. There's just no way, even if it's a fully just and consensual interaction between a white person and a black person, it's always within a frame of a power imbalance, and I think that's what it's getting at here. So, and what we're getting at here is the question that white people want to ask all the time, and I may be guilty of this too. Like, is what I did racist or not? Right? That's what white people want to know. They want to know. We want to know, like, am I a good person or not? It's not, oh, did I hurt someone or not? It's, is what I did racist or not? And like that one check mark, I can just check off the box. And so I think what these authors are asking us to do here is not for white people not to say, well, is what I did racist or not, but to say, how did the racist power structures in it impact this specific interaction? And that's something that will be a much better question to ask. You'll get better answers. So much of an analytical tool is asking the right questions. And now let's talk about this. If you're not one, you're not mine, from D&C 38. Okay, God commands his people to be one. Now, how do we get there? How do we get there? That's the thing. She doesn't talk anywhere in this article about the actions that it takes to get there where we're one. God doesn't say that we should label ourselves as one. He says we should be one. I think she's so focused on this idea of, oh, if we just all say we're one and say we're all equal, then we're done. And it's checking off a box with words and not with action, which gets back to, honoring God with your lips, but your heart not being there, or faith without works is dead, or straining out a gnat and gulping down a camel. This is exactly what's going on, and you get some of the most fury behind Jesus's words when you've got vulnerable people who are being hurt by people who are hypocritically thinking they're good and thinking they're checking off the boxes enough. And now I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but because I'm doing this video and I don't think very many people are going to watch this anyway, I just want to say what I want to say. Okay, but let's go back to D&C 38. What does D&C 38 actually say? Let's read the surrounding verses, because this is going to really blow her case out of the water. I'm going to read 25 through 27. Let me just take a drink real quick. Okay, so 25 through 27. And again I say unto you, let every man esteem his brother as himself. For what man among you, having 12 sons, and is no respecter of them, and they serve him obediently, and he saith unto the one, be thou clothed in robes, and sit thou here, and to the other, be thou clothed in rags, and sit thou there, and looketh upon his sons, and saith, I am just. Behold, I have given unto you as a parable, and it is even as I am. I say unto you, be one, and if ye are not one, ye are not mine. So the context of this parable isn't whether we label ourselves as one, it's how we treat each other. The whole point of this parable is, one, let every man esteem his brother as himself, verse 25. It results in action. Action, let's talk about that. This needs to result in action. This esteeming your brother as yourself isn't just how you feel about them in your heart, it's how you treat them. And let's look at verse 26. The whole point of this parable is you can't treat people differently and then say you're one. That's the exact opposite of what she's taking this to mean. She's saying all we have to do is say we're one. But the whole point of the parable is you can't say I am just, or you can't say we are all one if you treat people differently, or if you let people be treated differently. You are not one. And so this call towards unity is really, for her, a call towards the appeasement of her own conscience. She's like, no, I don't want to hear what I did was wrong, or I don't want to hear that I'm not doing enough, or I don't want to hear how people are hurting. I just want to hear how we're all one, and how we're all okay, and how there's no difference between us. I just want to hear those things. So she's taking this, which should be a call to action, and making it to be a call to inaction by soothing one's own conscience and checking off a box and saying, look, we're all one body, it doesn't matter. And and the whole point is, if we're all one body, it does matter, okay? And that's why I think it's really disingenuous that she cites 1 Corinthians 12, which marvelously talks about the balance between unity and diversity. We're not supposed to be all the same. We all have different gifts and different talents and different parts, and no part of the body can say to the other part, I have no need of you. Like, we need to go back and read the whole 1 Corinthians 12, and this is also used in Romans 12. Go back and look. We need everyone to be at the table, not despite the diversity, but because of it. We all have different callings. We all have different roles, and that's what the unity means. The unity is one of function, not a unity of uniformity, right? We're not all the same, but we are all one, okay? If we're a healthy body, no one part of the body will attack the other. And this is also really disingenuous, because this is a very commonly quoted statement about how the Lord looketh on the heart. Okay, let's talk about and I would hope that people know the context of this without even looking it up. But this is, the context is the prophet Samuel going to the sons of Jesse to pick and anoint the next king. And so Samuel, picks the tallest and strongest of the sons of Jesse and says, "Oh, look, you're probably the next king." And the Lord says to Samuel, "No, I don't look at appearances like man. I look on the heart." And in the context is one of choosing the runt. David was some young runt, not very strong, not very tall, not very pretty, not very whatever, just some marginalized person. The whole point of saying that God looks on the heart is to justify God's choice of someone who's marginalized, someone who's neglected. Like, literally, David wasn't even brought in to be considered because he was just out with the sheep. Like, go back and read this story. God chooses the marginalized and then says, I look on the heart, okay? And now what she's doing with this is to say we shouldn't even consider or categorize people by any outward appearance. And she's really not even, I better stop there, because there's no amount of time that would be long enough to do justice to figuring out what she's doing. Now let's talk about self-reliance here. Now we've got a real problem here. Speaking of body of Christ being one, I'm sorry that this is kind of out of order, but let's look at this and this talk about these dominant groups and power. Like that, an analysis of power and dominance is really behind a lot of what Paul says, like in Galatians 2 and in Romans 15, and then in Ephesians 2 with Jew and Gentile, that power dynamics. And if you look at Acts chapters 10, 11, and especially 15, where you've got the conversion of Cornelius and then the Jerusalem Council and the beginnings of the outreach to the Gentiles, you've got an analysis of groups, and B, you've got a theme of power and dominance that's emphasized. And let's talk about this. Themes of power and dominance are all over 1 Corinthians, right? Because so many of the divisions in 1 Corinthians were between those who were weak and those who were strong. All of their controversies around food or sex or worship or order or tongues or the sacrament, all of those things played out because of the power dynamics that were happening in the Christians of Corinth. Okay? You can't understand stuff without understanding the power dynamics. Like, is she going to say that the Apostle Paul is all about this awful social justice ideology? Yeah, I don't think so. So let's talk about self-reliance here. Self-reliance is a buzzword in the LDS world. She's using this as a token, as a way of purchasing the loyalty of the reader, okay? She's telling people, look, I'm LDS, and I'm on the right side because I'm using this word that everyone hears all the time. And let's talk about where this emphasis is. Okay? And connecting this with what's going on here. When the Lord picked David, he surprised people by picking the lowly and the outcast. So God has a really strong heart for those who are outcast and oppressed. Now, how does that pick up with self-reliance? This gets back to a question of truth versus emphasis. Yes, there is a truth about self-reliance that needs to be said at the right place and time, but there's also other truths that the Bible has to teach about oppressive systems. Let's go back to Leviticus 25 and the Jubilee. It doesn't say, whoops, if you have sold yourself into slavery, or if you've sold off your land, too bad for you, you should have been self-reliant. No, it has a structural and social and communal solution to the perpetuation of injustice, right? That I love the Jubilee year. Okay? So yes, now let me tell you when self-reliance works. Self-reliance works when the playing field is level and everyone has a head start. Like if we give people a head start and we have a level playing field, to some extent people can have a fair shot at pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, which I don't even like that phrase, right? And if we had no oppressive systems, then it would make sense for people to use their own efforts, their family, and then the church, and then community institutions. That's when self-reliance works. Like you wouldn't go up to, just to make the point obvious, you don't go up to a situation of severe injustice, such as slavery or the concentration camps or any of these things, and say, look, you just need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Be self-reliant. No, there needs to be a structural and social solution to these things. And yeah. So I talked about and let's look at some more things about emphasis. Let's look at the parable of the friend at midnight in Luke 11. Someone goes and says, look, I have guests over here. I need some bread. And goes and asks the friend. The friend doesn't say, oh, you should have been self-reliant, because there is a communal value of hospitality and helping one another. There's like a village mindset here rather than an individual mindset in the Bible. And and I think self-reliance presupposes a level playing field, like I said. And the Jubilee year, we talked about that, and how there's just so many other strands that need to be emphasized that if you fixate on self-reliance, you're just really telling more people about yourself than you are about the scriptures. Now let's talk about this, allowing little space for charity, growth, repentance, or forgiveness. We'd already talked about, and this is why I did this foundation with Jesus first, and then get here, because Jesus wasn't always going to fit Rebecca Taylor's expectations around charity, growth, repentance, and forgiveness, okay? I don't want to talk about this too much, but I do want to say that this is a slander about social justice because we want people to grow. We don't want people to stay racist. We want people to grow. And here's the real, it's a blessing for white people, but it's a tragic reality, is that black people and indigenous people have been the most forgiving, right? Look at all the stuff we've done, and the fact that we haven't, that white people haven't been killed off is actually forgiveness, right? And I don't want to turn black people or indigenous people into this model minority of patient suffering, and that, look at how awesome they are that they forgave us, because that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if they got, if we set the score, if they got even, what that would mean is, A, we would have centuries of white people being enslaved, and B, the indigenous people would send all the white people back to Europe. That would be the logical settling of the score. The fact that they have not done that means that black people and indigenous people, for all the wrong reasons, have had to be forgiving, right? So I really think that, and I hate to frame it that because white supremacy is so dominant, it means that people of other groups have had to be forgiving. May not have had a real choice. But what does that mean? It means that in the present context, we just want people to do better. We want people to make better choices, we just want people to do the right thing, and we can all move on. I don't think we don't really want people to feel shame or lacking of forgiveness or charity, all those other things. Let's talk about intentions, okay? The intentions. So here's a major self-contradiction in our article, because if you go up here, let's go all the way back up here. She says, she says, look, all of these social justice people have the right intentions. Look at all this about, the social justice people are drawn to it for deeply moral reasons, and they feel horror and grief at all this awful stuff that happens, and that's all valid. So she's saying, if she's saying that the intentions are the most important, she shouldn't be mad at all the social justice people, because now she's saying that if she's trying to legitimize the idea that the intentions are the most important thing, she has no basis for criticizing the social justice people. Now let's talk about this. I'm really going to skip over this whole paragraph because I really want straight allies to take on the burden of dealing with some of this stuff here. Okay, and besides, if I started talking about that, this would be another 3 hours long because there's so much to unpack. But one thing I do want to say is that let's talk about Black Lives Matter. The organization, which is not the same thing as the idea or the movement Black Lives Matter, but the organization seeks to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. First of all, the biblical approach to family is not Western. I just hate to say it to you. Surprise, the biblical world is not Western at all in its thinking. So much of the biblical world and the Book of Mormon world talks about the clan or the larger family or the extended family or the village, and that the village takes care of one another, and then when you marry into another family, you make a larger family. This isn't like you marry and like now it's a mom and a dad and 2 kids, and that's the only people in the world. And even the family, the Proclamation of the World says that there are exceptions, and that due to death, disability, or other circumstances, these may necessitate individual adaptation, right? If there's, and sometimes the extended family, right? I think there's a problem here that the Bible disrupts the Western prescribed nuclear family. And notice that it's not saying we want to get rid of families. It says we want to get rid of the requirement that all of your needs be met through the nuclear family. That's all it's saying. That they want to get rid of the requirement that centers the nuclear family as the source for meeting all of your needs. That's all this is saying, because that's what the Western prescribed nuclear family structure is. It is the idea that your primary social partner should be your spouse, and you should get all your needs met sexually, financially, morally, ethically, culturally. Like you should get all of your needs met through your spouse and your children or whatever. And I'm like, no, that's not how healthy societies work. We're all very much interdependent. And in terms of the homophobic and transphobic aspects of this, I am going to let other people talk about that. Let's talk about this. You shall know them by their fruits. Okay, what are the fruits of this movement? Actually, a lot of good. You see, look, she's doing a little checkbox move right here again. She says, "Look, I'm signaling that I'm good. I'm going to admit that there's some good that come out of this." Okay? But what she's trying to do is manipulate the reader into stopping the discussion about what we should do next. Okay? Manipulate the reader into stopping the discussion about what we should do next. And this goes back to this talk about action. Okay? All of our checkbox phrasing, what we say with our lips, needs to be in our heart and lead to action. And I think let's go back to what she says is the worst feature. She says the worst feature of critical social justice ideology is the intention. Like earlier she said, whoops, intention, blah, 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 whatever. Intentions are important. And now she's saying that the worst feature of critical social justice ideology is its intention. That it's trying to do the right. Like, imagine the boldness and the audacity of saying that the worst thing about this is that it's trying to do the right thing. Wow, okay? And this is, I just think it's a really kind of very self-serving. And this is why it goes back to how does this function, okay? Look, she's quoting this. This is one of the central texts, one of the classical texts for social justice in the Book of Mormon is to mourn with those that mourn. Also in this chapter, you have this idea of bearing one another's burdens. And the idea for, that's probably one of the best definitions of allyship, is not to say, hey, teach me, but it's to say, hey, I'm going to find out what's burdening you, and I'm going to lift that off your shoulders and put it onto mine. So if you're doing the work of an ally, you're going to be doing more work. You're going to be taking on a burden. It's not going to make your life easier. You're making someone else's life easier. And we have a covenantal obligation to mourn with those that mourn and comfort those that stand in need of comfort. But you have to have analytical tools to understand those who are mourning. You have to have the analytical tools that will lead you to act to comfort those that stand in need of comfort. This presupposes that you have the analytical tools that the social justice world is proposing. So now it says the critical social justice movement is not the way to address problems. Now, she doesn't say what is the way to address problems. She's just saying, well, maybe for all I have the good intentions or whatever. She doesn't actually talk about how to address these problems, right? She doesn't say what her actions are going to be. She's not going to do anything but soothe the consciences of people who are basically hypocrites. That is, they're saying the right words and not doing the right thing. And that's how this text functions. And she finishes by saying, any truly effective program and practice will be congruent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yeah, but you've got to know the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. You have to see how he was embedded into the power dynamics of his time. The Roman crucifixion engine, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, all of these things, you have to look at what Jesus Christ actually did and taught. And you have to have not only the right truths, but put them in the right context and have the right emphasis and the right tone. You need to comfort those that stand in need of comfort, which is exactly the opposite of what this article does. This article comforts those that don't need any more comfort, right? And I think this is the thing, is like, whose voices are we listening to? Are we listening to the voices that make us uncomfortable? Or are we listening to the voices that make us comfortable? And the social justice world is asking us, and Jesus is asking us to listen to the voices that make us uncomfortable if we are in power, right? And can do something about it. So that's kind of where I want to end this. Hopefully, we will see what other people say about this. And I just wish everyone would take these things to heart and not just agree with what I say verbally, but figure out a way that this can lead you into action. Because remember, faith without works is dead. And we should never honor God with our lips and have our heart far from him. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.